extinguished men came and made a sit-in in my driveway at Highgrove. They left a letter behind saying,
5 minutes ago, the palace confirmed a decision so devastating it has left the entire royal household frozen in disbelief. A single announcement has rewritten Sarah Ferguson's future in a way even her harshest critics never imagined. And what forced this winter verdict is darker, colder, and infinitely more heartbreaking than anyone knew. The announcement that broke the silence. It happened just after sunrise, at a moment when the pale winter light had barely begun to spread across the stone courtyards of Buckingham Palace. A single message emerged from the press office, quiet in appearance yet devastating in its impact. The palace confirms a significant and immediate change to the future of Sarah Ferguson. Those 16 words drifted across newsrooms like a sudden frost, settling first on the screens of early commuters before radiating outward into a global shockwave. It was the kind of announcement that arrived without warning, without ceremony, and without the gentle cushioning that usually softens royal decisions. Instead, it struck the nation with a cold clarity that left even seasoned correspondents momentarily still. Across the United Kingdom, the morning rhythm collapsed into murmurs of confusion and disbelief. A teacher in Leeds paused in the doorway of a nearly empty classroom as her phone illuminated with the alert. A train conductor at Paddington found himself reading the headline 3 times before accepting that it was not a test message. In Edinburgh, a nurse just off a night shift whispered to herself that this was the moment everyone had been expecting but no one was prepared to witness. And yet it was the viewers waking on the eastern seaboard of the United States who reacted with the greatest emotional intensity. Older audiences who remembered the bright-spirited young Duchess of the late 1980s stared wide-eyed at their televisions as anchors repeated the same stunned line. The palace has confirmed the heartbreaking news about Sarah Ferguson. What made this morning so unsettling was not simply the content of the announcement, it was the tone. Royal statements are known for their careful construction, their restrained diplomacy, and their ability to say everything and nothing at once. But this was different. The phrasing was stark, direct, and shaped with an unmistakable finality. It carried no promise of transition, no hint of reconsideration, and no path back toward restoration. It read as the last chapter of a story that had been fraying for years, closing with a firmness that left no room for speculation. Even veteran broadcasters at the BBC paused mid-sentence as the bulletin scrolled across their monitors, understanding immediately that something irreversible had occurred inside the palace walls. The shock was amplified by the suddenness with which the announcement was delivered. There had been whispers throughout the autumn that Sarah's position was becoming increasingly precarious. There had been murmured concerns about international investigations, reputational pressures, and the palace's growing insistence on a streamlined monarchy. But no one expected the decision to land this morning. Not like this. Not in a statement released just 5 minutes after the press office doors opened, when even senior correspondents had not yet taken their seats. It was as if the palace had been holding its breath for weeks and had finally exhaled with a force that carried the weight of inevitability. Inside newsrooms, phones rang in frantic succession as editors issued instructions and reporters scrambled for context. American networks interrupted their overnight broadcast to replay the palace announcement in slow, measured tones. Analysts in New York described it as a decisive severing that signaled a deeper restructuring within the monarchy. In London, commentators speculated that this was part of King Charles's long-promised modernization effort, one that demanded clarity and discipline in a world where royal narratives could shift globally within minutes. Yet beneath the surface of every discussion, the lingering emotion was grief. Not theatrical grief, not a sentimental longing for a bygone era, but a genuine sorrow that the woman who had once brought warmth and resilience to the royal stage was now standing outside its gates with no clear future in sight. What gave the announcement its especially heartbreaking quality was the absence of detail. The palace confirmed the decision, but offered no explanation beyond the barest institutional phrasing. There was no mention of her decades-long association with the royal household, no acknowledgement of her public efforts to rebuild her life, no reference to the loyalty she had shown to Andrew during his own downfall. The silence was its own message. It suggested that whatever conversations had taken place behind those guarded palace walls, they had reached a point beyond negotiation. There was a chill to the wording, a distant formality that made even political commentators describe it as a quiet exile delivered beneath the gray light of winter. Across Windsor, early risers noted an unusual stillness. The few staff members commuting to the estate remarked that the air felt heavier than usual, as though the atmosphere itself recognized that a chapter in royal history had quietly closed. In California, where the Sussex story often overshadows every royal narrative, the reaction was unexpectedly somber. Viewers who had once debated the Duchess of York's choices now found themselves asking what could have compelled the palace to act with such blunt force. Many of them had grown up watching her navigate scandals, financial turmoil, and public resurgence with a stubborn hopefulness. To see her name appear in a statement stripped of sentiment felt like witnessing a door close on a woman who had already lost so much. The significance of this morning cannot be overstated. The palace rarely issues announcements of this severity without months of deliberation and layers of internal review. For this decision to be released in such stark phrasing means the internal consensus was unwavering. It signals a shift in how the monarchy intends to position itself during a period of global scrutiny and domestic uncertainty. It also signals that Sarah Ferguson, once welcomed at family gatherings long after her divorce, has now been repositioned outside the protective circle of the crown. And as the world absorbed the news in real time, one truth became painfully clear. This was not a clarification, this was not a temporary adjustment, this was the monarchy drawing a boundary that would reshape Sarah's future forever. The long road that led to this winter decision. To understand why the palace moved with such finality this morning, we must return to the slower, quieter unraveling that began years earlier, long before the public sensed anything amiss. Sarah Ferguson had lived for decades in a delicate balance between royal familiarity and institutional distance. She was not a working royal, she held no formal position, yet she remained woven into the Windsor landscape in ways that defied precedent. Under the late Queen Elizabeth, her presence was tolerated gently, even affectionately, as a vestige of an earlier era. But when King Charles ascended the throne, the emotional exceptions that had once shielded her were steadily replaced by a colder institutional pragmatism. What came this morning was not sudden. It was the culmination of months, even years, of shifting priorities and tightening boundaries inside the monarchy. King Charles entered the role with a modernization philosophy that had been whispered about since the early 2000s. His vision was straightforward, at least in theory: a smaller monarchy, a sharper definition of public duty, a disciplined separation between personal loyalty and institutional necessity, and above all else, a heightened awareness that the crown now lived under constant global inspection. Every misstep was amplified instantly. Every association was analyzed from London to Los Angeles. Outdated arrangements that had once gone unnoticed under Queen Elizabeth became points of tension under Charles. Sarah's continued residence at Royal Lodge and her ambiguous proximity to royal life became increasingly difficult to justify in a world where clarity mattered more than nostalgia. The pressure was not solely internal. In the years following the renewed international investigations surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, questions about Sarah's past associations resurfaced with uncomfortable persistence. Her old email referring to Epstein as a steadfast and generous friend had been publicly dissected more times than anyone could count. Even though she had apologized, clarified, and distanced herself from those events, the digital world did not relinquish its grip. In the United States especially, where late-night panels and weekend commentators revisited the Epstein narrative with relentless fascination, Sarah's name was pulled into conversations that troubled the Foreign Office. It was whispered privately that American viewers over the age of 50 were increasingly confused by her continued presence in a Crown Estate residence. For a monarchy that relied heavily on international perception, especially among Commonwealth partners and older American audiences, this was not a small concern. It was structural. Within Buckingham Palace, senior aides began raising the subject during strategic winter meetings as early as the year 2022. The discussion started subtly. the cost of maintaining Royal Lodge, the unclear status of a non-working duchess living on Crown property, the scrutiny surrounding both her finances and her proximity to Andrew. Each concern was small on its own, but together they formed a picture that the institution could no longer ignore. Some advisors argued for a gradual transition, a quiet shift that would allow Sarah dignity and time. Others insisted that gradual measures had already stretched for nearly 3 decades. The monarchy was entering a new era, and sentiment could not be allowed to outweigh structural necessity. Through all of this, Sarah attempted to rebuild her financial independence. She wrote books, she launched projects, she partnered with charities. She appeared at events with warmth that reminded many of why the public once embraced her so deeply. But the palace saw something different. They saw instability. They saw unpredictability. They saw a figure who existed in a liminal space between royal and civilian life, with none of the protections of one and too many complications for the other. According to a senior aide, the monarchy could no longer carry the reputational burden of uncertainty. And in a period when Andrew himself was under immense scrutiny, Sarah's close proximity to him complicated matters further. The two continued to share Royal Lodge despite their divorce, a situation once labeled eccentric but later described in internal documents as institutionally untenable. As the autumn of 2024 approached, the palace's tone shifted from concern to urgency. International investigators renewed their focus on several Epstein-connected documents. American networks revived long-archived footage that mentioned Sarah's name in passing. Social media algorithms amplified old scandals as if they were unfolding in real time. Within the communications department, a young analyst presented a troubling report indicating that royal reputational risks linked to Sarah had doubled within a single quarter. The spike was traced largely to American audiences over the age of 50, a group that held deep influence over how foreign networks shaped narratives about the monarchy. When this report reached Camilla and Charles, it became clear that silent tolerance was no longer sustainable. Camilla, who understood better than most how unforgiving public opinion could be, began to push for a reevaluation of Sarah's residency and royal association. Her view was not personal, it was procedural. The monarchy could not modernize while carrying unresolved reputational remnants from the past. Princess Anne, always guided by duty over sentiment, shared this perspective. She believed that institutions survived by maintaining clear boundaries. Sarah had been granted grace for decades, but grace, in Anne's mind, was not the same as permanent protection. What had once been a sympathetic exception had become a structural inconsistency. William's perspective was more complex, yet more decisive. He respected Sarah's history. He valued her role as the mother of his cousins. But as the future king, he viewed the monarchy as an organism that required discipline to endure. 5 warning signs the public never saw. Long before the palace delivered this morning's heartbreaking confirmation, there were signs that Sarah Ferguson's future inside the royal landscape was growing increasingly fragile. These signs did not appear on front pages or in public commentary. They emerged quietly, deep within the administrative machinery of the monarchy, noticed only by those who understood the rhythm of royal life intimately. To the public, Sarah remained a familiar figure hovering at the edge of the royal frame. But to senior officials monitoring the growing storm, each subtle shift marked a step toward a conclusion they hoped they could delay, but knew they could never escape. What happened this morning did not begin with scandal or confrontation. It began with whispers, patterns, and early anomalies that pointed to a truth no one wished to acknowledge. The first significant warning sign surfaced nearly 2 years ago during a routine review at Kensington Palace. Princess Catherine, who approaches royal documentation with a level of precision that has long impressed senior staff, noticed a troubling detail while scanning a briefing packet on Crown Estate properties. The projected maintenance costs for Royal Lodge had nearly doubled within a single forecast period. That alone was not alarming. Older estate properties often saw unpredictable fluctuations, but what caught Catherine's attention was the accompanying note written in a cautious hand. The complication remains the continued residence of the Duchess of York. It was the kind of phrasing used only when staff were trying to convey seriousness without drawing outright alarm. Catherine closed the folder slowly, sensing a shift in tone that suggested the palace was preparing for decisions that would not be easy. The second warning arrived through a series of sentiment analyses conducted by internal communications teams. These reports, rarely seen by the public, measure how different demographics respond to various royal figures. Catherine was reviewing one such packet when a sharp rise in negative sentiment appeared beside Sarah's name. The increase was most pronounced among American viewers over the age of 50, a group that still associated Sarah with the scandals of the 1990s and viewed her residency at Royal Lodge as inconsistent with the modern image the monarchy was attempting to cultivate. The report's summary was written with clinical restraint but carried heavy meaning. Public understanding of the Duchess of York remains tenuous due to unresolved historical associations. Catherine understood immediately that sentiment trends often foreshadow decisions waiting quietly in the background. The third warning emerged from Windsor itself. Sarah and Andrew had shared Royal Lodge for decades in an arrangement that confused commentators but remained oddly functional. Their dynamic had survived divorce, scandal, and financial strain. But in the early months of last year, staff working on the estate began to observe a subtle but undeniable shift. Andrew grew more withdrawn, more reactive to the tightening palace scrutiny. Sarah, meanwhile, became increasingly restless, moving between engagements and commitments with a distracted energy that suggested she sensed instability beneath the surface. One footman remarked privately that the house felt colder, as though the occupants were bracing for a winter they did not yet see. When such observations reached Catherine through informal staff channels, she recognized a pattern she had seen before. A household that had weathered decades of tension was beginning to fracture not emotionally, but structurally. That kind of change never remained private for long. The fourth warning sign came from across the Atlantic. In the late summer of last year, several American networks began airing investigative segments revisiting the Epstein timeline, a topic that resurfaces with fierce intensity whenever new documents emerge. Though Sarah was not a central figure in those discussions, her name appeared in several panels, sometimes through misinterpretation, and sometimes through resurfaced archival clips. For a monarchy deeply concerned about diplomatic relations, particularly with the United States, this development was alarming. The Foreign Office quietly notified senior advisors that public narratives surrounding the Duchess of York were complicating diplomatic messaging. They phrased it delicately. The Crown may benefit from increased clarity regarding the standing of the Duchess of York. In royal language, clarity is often a prelude to severance. But the fifth warning sign, the one that truly shifted the palace from unease to urgency, surfaced in an internal document known as the Reputational Risk Index. This highly confidential assessment, updated quarterly, assigns risk levels to individuals associated with the royal household. Sarah had appeared on the index before, usually at moderate levels, but in the autumn of last year, her rating rose sharply due to the intersection of three concerns: her continued residence on a crown estate without a formal role, her indirect association with Andrew during his legal and financial turmoil, and the international media's renewed interest in her historical connections. The language of the report was unmistakably grave. The continued positioning of the Duchess of York within the royal residential structure presents a reputational vulnerability inconsistent with modernization strategy. When Anne read these lines, she reportedly closed the folder and said plainly, "This cannot continue." The meetings that sealed Sarah's fate. By the time the palace entered the late stages of autumn, the conversations surrounding Sarah Ferguson had shifted from concern to strategy. Senior advisors no longer discussed her future as a question of possibility. They discussed it as a matter of timing. And within the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace and Windsor, a series of private meetings unfolded, each one cutting away the remaining threads tethering Sarah to the institution she once called home. These meetings were not dramatic in tone. They were steady, methodical, and shaped by a sense of duty that overshadowed sentiment. Yet within them lay the moments that sealed her fate long before the public received its devastating confirmation this morning. The first pivotal meeting took place inside Clarence House in mid-October. Camilla had requested a briefing on international press behavior after several American networks revisited archival clips that mentioned Sarah in connection with the Epstein narrative. The communications director opened a thick folder of summaries, each page highlighting the uncomfortable rise in Sarah's visibility during discussions that were already treacherous for the monarchy. Camilla listened quietly, her fingers lightly pressed against her chin as she absorbed each statistic. She had weathered relentless public storms herself and understood the danger of unresolved associations. When the briefing concluded, she spoke only one sentence: "This will soon require formal resolution." Those words traveled quickly through the communications and legal teams, signaling that the Queen Consort herself had recognized the growing risk. Soon after, Princess Anne held her own meeting with senior ceremonial staff in Windsor. Known for her directness and unwavering dedication to protocol, Anne approached the matter from an entirely different perspective. Her concern was not rooted in media coverage, but in institutional discipline. During the meeting, a staff member presented a report outlining inconsistencies in the Royal Lodge arrangement and its growing misalignment with Charles's modernization goals. Anne read the summary slowly, not with shock but with the resignation of someone who had seen this outcome forming for years. She looked up and delivered the words that would later be repeated in internal memoranda. "The monarchy cannot maintain exceptions that conflict with its future structure." In Anne's view, sentiment was valuable, but survival was paramount, and Sarah's presence within a crown residence no longer aligned with the evolving architecture of the institution. William entered the discussion soon after, bringing a perspective shaped by both strategic foresight and personal responsibility. He had always shown respect toward Sarah as the mother of his cousins, yet he also carried the heavy burden of safeguarding the monarchy's future. When he met privately with senior advisors in Kensington Palace, he studied a collection of reputational risk reports detailing how Sarah's name had resurfaced internationally. The section that struck him most described the potential for diplomatic tension if American media continued to blur her past associations with broader royal narratives. William set the report down, his face composed but resolute. The Crown cannot enter another year with unresolved vulnerabilities. His voice was calm, but the room fell silent as though a verdict had been spoken. For William, clarity was not cruelty, it was necessity. The most consequential meeting, however, occurred when Camilla and Anne presented their concerns jointly to King Charles in the Blue Drawing Room. Charles had received fragments of these discussions for months, but he had been reluctant to confront the matter directly. His history with Sarah was layered with decades of shared family experience, holidays, celebrations, grief, and complicated loyalties. But as the two women outlined the mounting pressures, Charles's expression shifted from contemplative to deeply burdened. They showed him the communications analysis indicating rising negative sentiment abroad. They reviewed the Foreign Office warnings about diplomatic perception. They presented the legal briefing that stated explicitly that the Royal Lodge arrangement was incompatible with the modernization plan. And finally, Anne placed before him the reputational risk index, the one listing Sarah as a structural vulnerability. The room held a long, fragile silence. Charles leaned back slightly, staring at the portraits of his mother and father that lined the far wall. The monarchy had survived because of its ability to evolve. It had endured because it acted decisively in moments when hesitation could have been fatal. He knew all of this, yet he also felt the weight of what this decision would mean for a woman who had fallen, risen, stumbled again, and kept trying in her own imperfect but earnest way to find a place of stability. After several minutes, he finally spoke, his voice soft and strained. "Begin drafting the necessary arrangements." Those 6 words closed the chapter more definitively than any public announcement ever could. From that moment on, the palace machinery moved with brisk coordination. Legal teams prepared the language that would remove Sarah from remaining royal provisions. Communications advisors crafted various versions of the statement. Some softened, some firm, all carrying the same unavoidable truth. Senior aides reviewed every sentence to ensure it would withstand scrutiny both domestically and internationally. William rejected drafts he felt were too vague, insisting that clarity was the only way to avoid speculation spiraling into another media storm. Camilla emphasized the importance of tone, reminding everyone that the statement must appear procedural rather than punitive. Anne insisted on preserving dignity without obscuring necessity. These three voices shaped the final message the world received today. Throughout this period, discussions surrounding Sarah became quieter but more urgent. Staff noticed doors closing more often, hushed conversations lingering in hallways, and documents being carried in discreet folders from office to office. Royal residences have their own internal weather, and during this phase the atmosphere felt cold, anticipatory, almost suspended. Everyone understood that a decision of lasting consequence was approaching, and when the final version of the announcement was placed on Charles's desk, he read it not once but twice, his expression solemn. The crown must move forward with clarity. Those were his final words before giving approval. By the time the palace released the confirmation this morning, Sarah's fate had already been sealed through a sequence of meetings defined not by emotion, but by institutional gravity. The monarchy had drawn a boundary that could no longer be postponed. This chapter was closed behind closed doors long before the public heard the news. And as the world now grapples with the shock of this revelation, the truth remains painfully clear. The decision was not born of a single moment. It was born of many. And each meeting, each briefing, each whispered concern became another step toward the heartbreaking outcome the palace announced today. 5 minutes ago, the statement and the collapse. The moment itself unfolded with a stillness that did not match the scale of what it carried. It was shortly after 7 this morning when the palace released the announcement that would alter Sarah Ferguson's future permanently. The statement appeared not through ceremony or televised broadcast, but through a quiet document uploaded to the palace press site, accompanied by a brief notice sent to senior correspondents. Within 5 minutes, the words had crossed continents. The Duchess of York will no longer receive royal provisions or institutional support effective immediately. The phrasing was restrained, but the meaning reverberated across the world with a force that left even the most prepared journalists momentarily breathless. Inside a modest hotel suite in London, Sarah Ferguson had been awake long before dawn. She had sensed for weeks that the palace was nearing a decision she did not wish to name aloud. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, had encouraged her to rest, but sleep had grown elusive, and so she sat at a small writing desk wrapped in a shawl, quietly reviewing notes for a project she hoped would offer her stability in the coming year. Then her phone lit up. At first she thought it was another morning alert, but when she saw the royal crest at the top of the notification, her breath caught. She tapped the screen and read slowly, almost fearfully, as if delaying each sentence might soften its meaning. It did not. What struck her most was not the loss itself. She had known that Royal Lodge was slipping out of reach. She had known that support structures she once took for granted were now subject to review. What cut through her, sharp and cold, was the tone, the absence of warmth, the unmistakable finality. The palace did not frame the decision as transition. It did not suggest reconsideration. It did not acknowledge her decades of public reinvention or her efforts to raise her daughters in the storm of scandal. It spoke with the distant voice of an institution drawing a boundary that could not be crossed again. Sarah read the statement twice, then set the phone down with hands that trembled despite her efforts to steady them. Across newsrooms in London, New York, and Sydney, anchors interrupted scheduled programming to deliver the breaking announcement. The conversations grew frantic as analysts attempted to piece together the internal pressures that must have preceded the decision. Some described it as the final chapter of Charles's modernization plan. Others framed it as a necessary step to clarify the monarchy's public position amid growing international scrutiny. But on screen, the prevailing emotion was disbelief. Sarah Ferguson, once embraced as a spirited outsider who brought warmth to the royal narrative, had now been removed from the institution with a statement that felt stark enough to echo. In Edinburgh, commuters paused mid-step to read the alert glowing on their phones. In Birmingham, a retired couple who had followed Sarah's story for decades watched the announcement on their television and fell silent. In the United States, older viewers who remembered her exuberance during the late 1980s were struck by the severity of the palace's tone. To them, the statement read less like a procedural update and more like a sudden closure, a door swinging shut on a woman who had already spent years walking the narrow line between reinvention and consequence. Commentators on American morning shows described it as the most definitive severing of royal association since the early days of the Sussex departure. But inside the palace, the reaction was more subdued. Senior aides had been bracing for the release, but even they felt a heaviness settle in the air as the statement circulated. William received confirmation that the announcement had gone live and spent several minutes in quiet reflection before continuing with his scheduled engagements. Anne, who had warned for years that unresolved inconsistencies would eventually demand institutional action, reviewed the press reaction with the steely calm she was known for. Camilla, who had urged Charles to finalize the decision before another media cycle erupted, remained silent as she watched early coverage unfold. And Charles himself, despite approving the statement, was said to have looked profoundly weary, aware that he had just overseen a choice that would be remembered for years. Meanwhile, Sarah sat alone for several minutes before reaching for her phone again. Messages began pouring in from friends, former colleagues, and sympathizers from around the world. But the first calls came from her daughters. Beatrice, speaking in a voice heavy with emotion, promised she would come to her immediately. Eugenie, ever protective, asked if her mother was safe and whether journalists had already begun gathering outside the hotel. Their responses carried a mixture of grief and determination. They had known this moment was approaching. They had quietly arranged alternative plans, including accommodations abroad, should Sarah need distance or privacy. But knowing something is coming and living it are entirely different experiences. As the news continued to spread, royal commentators pointed to one detail above all others: the absence of the phrase "subject to review." Without those words, the statement carried the unmistakable weight of permanence. It meant the monarchy had already considered its position, already debated its alternatives, already reached its conclusion. There was no transitional framework, no phased reduction, only a declaration that her association with royal support structures had ended. It was a clean break executed with the kind of precision usually reserved for constitutional matters. By late morning, the devastation of the moment had settled into public consciousness. People began asking not only what the palace had done, but what would become of Sarah now. How would she navigate a world without the institutional safety net that had protected her for so many years? What did this mean for her finances, her residence, and her well-being? The palace offered no further comment. That silence spoke as loudly as the statement itself. Today, the world witnessed the culmination of years of private tension, strategic deliberation, and institutional recalibration. Sarah Ferguson's future had changed irrevocably in the span of 5 minutes. But the emotional collapse that followed did not belong to the public. It belonged to her, alone in a quiet room, holding the phone that delivered the words that ended the chapter she had fought for decades to keep alive. What happens to Sarah now? In the hours after the palace confirmed its heartbreaking decision, a quiet but immeasurable shift began to unfold around Sarah Ferguson's life. The world saw the announcement. It saw the headlines, the commentary, the sudden wave of shock that rippled through morning broadcasts. But what it could not see, at least not yet, was the profound unraveling taking place behind closed doors. For Sarah, the future that once had a semblance of stability was now dissolving beneath her feet. And the question echoing across continents was the same. Where does she go from here? Without the shield of royal provisions, without the subtle protections that followed her for decades, what remains for a woman who had lived half her life at the edges of an institution that has now drawn a line she cannot cross again? Her first concern, inevitably, was where she would live. Royal Lodge had been more than a residence. It was the one space where she had raised her daughters, weathered the storms that followed Andrew's scandals, and rebuilt herself after years of public scrutiny. But the statement released this morning removed any ambiguity. Royal Lodge would no longer remain her home. Even if Andrew remained there for a time, the structure that allowed Sarah to stay had now collapsed. Senior aides have already begun preparations for the full transition, and sources close to the family have quietly acknowledged that discussions about relocating Sarah had been circulating for months. Her daughters, anticipating this moment, have arranged temporary accommodations abroad, most notably in Portugal, where Beatrice and Eugenie have close connections. Whether Sarah accepts that refuge remains uncertain, but what is clear is that the palace expects her departure sooner rather than later. Financially, the implications are just as severe. For decades, Sarah balanced her income through writing, speaking engagements, charitable partnerships, and the occasional entrepreneurial venture. But without the symbolic association of the royal household, many of these avenues may shift dramatically. Branding experts have already noted that companies often gravitate toward figures who maintain at least some ceremonial link to the monarchy. That link has now been severed completely. Her book royalties will continue, but the opportunities that depended on her positioning as a semi-royal figure will inevitably diminish. In practical terms, Sarah must build a future using resilience rather than legacy. And while she has endured financial hardship before, this is the first time she faces it entirely without the quiet safety net that once softened the edges of consequence. In the realm of international perception, the consequences may be even more delicate. The United States, in particular, has long been a country where Sarah felt understood and welcomed. But it is also the country where the revived inquiries surrounding Epstein have gained the most traction. With the palace distancing itself from her in such unequivocal language, investigators and media outlets may interpret the announcement as a signal that the monarchy no longer wishes to offer even the appearance of proximity. Although Sarah is not a target of any active investigation, perception plays an enormous role in how narratives evolve. Without institutional alignment, she now stands alone in shaping her public identity, and that solitude is both liberating and perilous. Her daughters, heartbreakingly aware of the emotional toll their mother now faces, have stepped into a new role. For years, Beatrice and Eugenie lived with the complicated shadow surrounding their parents. They navigated royal obligations, public curiosity, and private grief with extraordinary grace. Now the roles have reversed. They are no longer the children seeking stability. They are the women providing it. People close to the family say they have been making preparations behind the scenes for weeks, understanding that once the palace crossed this threshold, there would be no path back. Their priority is not public image. It is ensuring their mother has a soft landing in a world that has grown increasingly sharp. And then there is Andrew, a figure whose downfall set much of this machine in motion. His position remains precarious, but his fate and Sarah's are no longer intertwined in the way they once were. For decades, they survived together inside the walls of Royal Lodge, even after their marriage dissolved. They relied on one another, defended one another, and became a strange symbol of loyalty in a family built on protocol. But now the monarchy's boundaries have tightened around both of them. Whatever decisions are made regarding Andrew's future residence, Sarah will not be part of that arrangement. Their lives, long braided by circumstance, are quietly diverging. The most significant shift, however, is internal, not logistical. For the first time since 1986, Sarah Ferguson must define herself entirely outside the frame of royal narrative. She will not have royal patronages to support. She will not have ceremonial appearances to attend. She will not have access to palace advisors who once offered guidance, even in the background. She will be Sarah, not the Duchess of York in any functional sense, but a private citizen navigating a world that has already formed opinions about her before she steps into any room. There is a particular loneliness in losing the institution that shaped half of one's life. It is not simply the loss of a title or residence. It is the loss of proximity, the loss of belonging, the loss of a story that once promised redemption. And yet, in the quiet hours following the announcement, something else began to emerge. Those close to Sarah say she has always possessed a stubborn spirit, a kind of hopeful defiance that allowed her to survive crises that would have crushed others. They believe she will find a way to reinvent herself again, even if the road ahead is colder than any she has walked before. For the monarchy, the meaning of this moment is equally significant. By severing ties so completely, the crown has signaled a future shaped by clarity, by discipline, by an unwillingness to carry the shadows of the past into a world where every misstep becomes global within moments. This is not only the end of Sarah's chapter within the royal orbit, it is a declaration of how the institution intends to survive the pressures of modern scrutiny. And while the decision may have been strategic, it was also deeply human in its consequence. A life has been altered, a woman has been displaced, a family has been forced to rearrange itself around a truth it can no longer avoid. Tonight, as the world continues to dissect the palace's statement, Sarah Ferguson stands at the threshold of a life she did not expect to face at this stage. Ahead of her lies uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. Behind her lies the palace, the institution that shaped her, accepted her, rejected her, welcomed her back, and has now closed its doors with irrevocable finality. And in the winter quiet of this day, one truth settles over everything. Sarah Ferguson is stepping into a future she must build on her own, far from the crown that once defined her, guided only by the resilience that has carried her this far. In the quiet aftermath of this morning's announcement, a feeling hangs over the nation that cannot be easily measured or explained. It is the strange stillness that follows a moment of irreversible change, when the world has not yet adjusted to the new shape of things. Sarah Ferguson's story has always been one of unexpected turns, of stumbling and standing again, of learning to breathe beneath the weight of public judgment. But today marks a shift that reaches far beyond headlines. It is a reshaping of identity, of belonging, of the place she once held within a monarchy now determined to define its future with unprecedented clarity. And as the public absorbs the magnitude of this decision, there is an unspoken recognition that a chapter has closed not only for Sarah, but for the institution itself. For decades, she lived in a space that was neither inside nor outside the royal circle, a position that allowed her to remain connected even as she rebuilt her life on her own terms. But now, the palace has drawn its boundary with unmistakable precision, leaving her to navigate a world that no longer carries the familiar echoes of royal corridors. And yet, in the midst of that loss, there remains a truth that even the most polished statements cannot erase. Sarah Ferguson has survived storms that would have silenced others long ago. She has rebuilt herself through scandal, heartbreak, financial turmoil, and the relentless gaze of the public. The removal of royal provisions may change her circumstances, but it does not diminish the resilience she has carried through every chapter of her life. And so the question that lingers tonight is not simply what the palace has taken away, but what Sarah will choose to build in its place. The monarchy has spoken. Its message is final. But her story is not finished. Somewhere beyond the scrutiny, beyond the corridors of Windsor and the structured echoes of protocol, a woman stands facing the uncertain horizon of her next beginning. Whether she finds solace in the quiet, courage in the challenge, or hope in the unknown, the world will be watching not out of curiosity, but out of a recognition that some figures are defined not by the titles they lose, but by the battles they continue to fight. And as the sun sets on the day the palace confirmed the heartbreaking news about Sarah Ferguson's future, one truth resonates with undeniable clarity. Institutions may decide the boundaries of their own survival, but individuals decide the meaning of their own lives. Sarah steps forward now not as a duchess in waiting, nor as a figure suspended between scandal and redemption, but as a woman who has weathered nearly 4 decades of public turbulence and still finds the strength to rise. Her next chapter begins here beyond the palace gates, in the quiet space where reinvention and resolve take root. And whatever comes next, it is certain that her story, far from fading, has entered a new and deeply human chapter the world will not soon forget.